Hi everyone, welcome to Life Edge, because life, well, doesn't have to be mediocre. I'm Rick Zanotti, and I am joined today by Dr. Susan Nash. Hi Susan, how are you?
I'm well. I'm looking forward to having our guest and to talking about hijinks and strange spy novels.
All sorts of interesting
reality.
things. And joining us today, actually, he's going to be in studio and in the show as well. We've got Harold Muliati, who is our video producer. He heard Dr. Ed was coming, and he says, I have questions. Can I come on too? Sure. So, Dr. Ed is always popular. Of course, we call him Our Highness because he's actually the King of Scotland, or the... Yes. Anyway, we've got with us today Dr. Ed Stuart again, our favorite economist and all-around good friend. Here we go.
This show is sponsored by Relate Corporation. Digital learning development, media development, corporate video, management consulting, and more. Visit us at www.relate.com. Thanks.
And we are back, and joining us not in the center position of power, but in the upper left position of power. We have a little kind of Hollywood Square setup today. Anyway, how you doing, Ed?
Good. Nice to see you, Rick. Nice to see you, Susan. Nice to see you, Harold.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Harold did hear you were coming on. He says, can I come on? I really want to ask some questions about our topic today. Sure. And Harold's had... Well, go ahead, Harold.
Why don't we go ahead and let Harold ask a question, and then I can go from there, and then maybe Susan can ask questions, and then if there's something that needs to be said additionally, I can do that. But I'll bow to the powers that be on your end, Rick.
That sounds good. So, Harold, go ahead.
All right. One thing I wanted to ask was because on the previous show we had with you, then we were talking a bit about Belarus as kind of the last Soviet economy still standing, last Soviet-style economy. And I was wondering about, there are some of these other states, partially recognized states, I guess, that have a little bit of carryover from some of the Soviet period stuff, but aren't necessarily running Soviet-style governments, like Transnistria and like Artsakh, formerly known as the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic. I was wondering what your thoughts on those were.
Well, they're more kind of like Russia and China. They're a mixture. They've got some private enterprise, private agriculture. The interesting thing about Belarus, for somebody like me who's really interested in comparative systems and came out of Soviet studies, is that for all intents and purposes, Belarus is still a real Soviet-type economy. The main industries are owned by the government. And that's why the opposition to Mr. Lukashenko, although the people in the streets are somewhat upsetting to him, what's really critical to him are the workers in the state tractor factories, the state automobile factories, the state collective farms, which is where Mr. Lukashenko came from. So there's almost no private enterprise in Belarus at all. And it really is a state socialist communist system. And the other thing, you ask a really good question, Harold. The thing that separates Belarus from Russia is that in Belarus, because everything is owned by the government, Lukashenko is the only person with power or wealth. Whereas in Russia, Putin is obviously the most powerful and the most wealthy, but there are other actors that have great wealth, not necessarily great power, because there is some kind of hybrid private enterprise in the Russian Federation, and there isn't any in Belarus, which is why the fight in leader, the czar, if you will.
Now, Ed, when I heard Harold's question at lunch, he was asking me what he was going to ask you. He was telling me what he was going to ask you. I hadn't even heard of those two countries. I went, okay, that's interesting, guys. I guess there's sub-countries within other countries almost. What about Cuba? Are they still kind of a Soviet-style economy?
Yeah, that's a good point, Rick. They're pretty close to still kind of classic communism.
Yeah.
Although in Cuba there are private enterprise.
Okay.
Spanish hotel, French tourist agencies, and so there's a little bit of private enterprise in Cuba, not much. So it's probably you're right, Rick. Cuba is closer to Belarus than it is to Russia or China.
Interesting.
In terms of the ownership and the power. So that the head of the Cuban Communist Party is pretty similar to Lukashenko in that whatever they decide, they don't have to go through a second step of talking to somebody who owns, quote unquote, the private enterprise that they're attempting to control or to influence.
Interesting. Now, there's only one more I can think of, and that would be maybe Nicaragua. Are they still communist?
No, they're pretty much on the way to a mixed economy.
Okay.
And it may be the fact that Ortega, who started out as a kind of a full-fledged communist Sandinista, I think his family, they kind of turned into Putin in that they have some private enterprise that they have denationalized and taken control of. So
okay.
And there are private hotels and restaurants and so forth in Nicaragua as well.
Okay.
So I have a question, really quickly.
Yes.
Okay, so one of the things that fascinates me is what you've talked about in the kind of disintegration of this communist state. Some of the things that are happening, including the poisoning. Could you tell us a little bit about what you think, your take on the poisoning of the prominent politician?
Yes, that's really, Susan, you've asked the most important question, because the Belarus, I know some people from Belarus. I've had a couple of students at my university here in Chicago from Gomel, which is a slightly smaller city than Minsk, but Belarus obviously isn't that big of an issue on the world stage, or obviously not that much of an issue to the United States. But the thing about Belarus is that it's a model, and maybe the German word is the best, Vorbild, meaning the picture before the main story. And let me just give you a quote from my friend Leonid Volkov, who's Navalny's chief of staff. He was quoted in the August 29th, September 4th issue of The Economist. The cover story was "What Putin Fears," and there's a picture of Navalny and next to Putin. And the quote by Volkov is, quote, "Lukashenko with a rifle or Putin with his poison? Which one of them is more crazy? What is happening in Belarus today provides some clues about what awaits Russia in the very near future." Now, I'm not sure about the very near future part, but one of the things that keeps Putin awake at night is that something like what happened in East Germany when he was there in Dresden as a KGB operative, what happened in Tiananmen Square that almost overthrew the Communist Party of China, and what happened in the Ukraine, first in 2004 with the Orange Revolution, and then what happened in 2014 when Yanukovych, the premier whose campaign advisor, of course, was Paul Manafort, right, Putin's stooge, and what Yanukovych, his political mistake was he was supposed to sign a an association agreement with the European Union and decided not to. He decided to sign an association agreement with Russia, and then the Maidan protests erupted, and the citizens in Kiev and Lvov and Odessa wrapped themselves in the EU flag and sent Mr. Yanukovych back to Moscow, and sent Mr. Manafort off to run the other Putin stooge, Trump's campaign in the U.S. So what Putin is afraid of is that sooner or later his hold on power and his wealth is going to be swept aside. Now, whether the very near future, I think, is a little bit more hope than realistic. Mr. Volkov, Leonid, a young guy, is kind of the opposite of the typical Russian. Most Russians, or the characteristic of Russians, is they're very pessimistic, right? Things are always going to turn out badly.
Yeah.
But one of the hallmarks of, I think one of the attractions of Navalny and Volkov and his people is that they're optimists. They think things can change, right? And they have strategies for change in a difficult situation. So the very near future may not be this year or may not be next year, but I think it's fair to say that sometime in the next 5 years, what's happening in Khabarovsk, what's happening in Novosibirsk and Tomsk and kind of the outlying major cities of the Russian Federation will eventually get swept up into Moscow. And Navalny has young people, especially active, engaged, intelligent young people, the ones that haven't left Russia. And that's where the future is, right? For Mr. Navalny, the future may be a successful assassination. He just yesterday was released from the hospital, the Charité hospital in Berlin, in what was East Berlin, but he's in Berlin now, and he intends to go back to Russia, which is a kind of courage I can't even imagine. But it's a testimony to a kind of Russian soul that believes in kind of an ultimate moral value, if you will. Although Navalny, and the thing about Navalny and especially Volkov is they're very astute information technology people. They understand the internet, they understand information technology and communication, and that's a different thing, different from what happened in East Germany, what happened in Tiananmen Square. Although they all of these things, the Tiananmen Square, East Germany, the anti-Putin demonstrations that started in 2012, and then most recently the Lukashenko, they're all about phony elections. They're all about elections that were obviously corrupt and undemocratic.
Now, Ed, do you find it interesting that pretty much almost within the same time frame, Xi Jinping in China declared himself leader for life? Putin pretty much extended his reign until, I think, his 90s. It is sort of interesting. Is this the old communists or the old dictators wanting to hold on for dear life?
Yeah, and it's a little bit more strategic than that, Rick, and it's something I didn't understand until I listened to Mr. Volkov's speech here in Chicago at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And he pointed out, this was in his talk where I met him, was November the 29th, 2018.
Okay.
And he pointed out that as soon as there's an end date for Putin's regime, and by implication, your very wise point, Rick, as soon as there's an end date for Xi Jinping, then there's starting to be a fight. Who's going to take over, right? So if you're a fan of The Sopranos, as soon as Richie Aprile was dying of cancer, then who was going to take over? So the problem for Putin is that as soon as he's on his way out of office, then he doesn't have as much power. So he's got to stay until the end, right? One of my favorite Ronald Reagan quotes is that the Soviet Union didn't have elections; they have funerals, right? And that's, I think, what Putin is hoping for and what Xi Jinping is hoping for, because, and you bring up a good parallel, Rick. Not only is Putin more and more undemocratic, but Xi Jinping is coming in that way as well. And the demonstrations in Hong Kong also have a potential demonstration effect, right? That what's going on in Hong Kong, there are people in Shanghai and Beijing and Chengdu and so forth that they see that, right? And they think, aha, this may be a way to exert some power over our lives. So the importance, to go back to Susan's questions, the importance of Belarus is that it's a prelude, or it's the if you want to use a football analogy, it's a preseason or an exhibition game that will let people see what kinds of activities are possible.
Now, do you think Lukashenko will leave office, or is he going to hold on for dear life again?
He's going to hold on for dear life, and that's a question. The other question, Rick, is that one of the things that I suspect Putin and his folks are trying to do is trying to figure out if there's somebody that they can put in there that's less controversial than Putin, but could be kind of a compromise. This is an old communist trick.
Yep.
The Polish did this about every 10 years. They'd have, to quote the Who, meet the new boss, same as the old boss, but they'd have the old guy who built up a lot of kind of negative whatever, and then they'd bring in the new quote unquote reformer, and then he'd be around for a few years, and then it would turn out that, of course, he wasn't a real reformer. Right. He was just a new face on an old regime. So it may be that Lukashenko will go, but how he goes and who he's replaced by may be somebody we don't know about right now that will suddenly turn up. Right?
I was wondering about something that you said earlier. You mentioned what's happening in Khabarovsk. What is for those of us that are not as up on the the events and happenings in Russia? What is
Khabarovsk, Harold? Yeah, one of my favorite cities. Right. One of the things I always point out to people, and this was pointed out to me when my mom and I did the Trans-Siberian, and we had our first visit was in Khabarovsk, which is nearly on the Pacific. It's on the Amur River, and you can look across the Amur into China, but it's about 7,000 miles due east of Moscow. And what the people in Irkutsk pointed out is that they have a much more latitude to be somewhat independent, because they're already in Siberia. Where are you going to send us if we misbehave? And also, if you're 7,000 miles away from Moscow, there's not as much direct control as if you're right in Moscow or St. Petersburg, which isn't that far from Moscow. What happened in Khabarovsk is that there was an election for the regional governor of the far eastern province, and the Putin guy lost to a somewhat independent former businessman turned politician, but probably a kind of a regional favorite, and somebody who pledged to do well for the ordinary citizens of Khabarovsk. Now, the problem was that 25 years ago, when he was an aspiring businessman, he might have rubbed a few guys out, right? And that's just the way you did business in the 90s in post-Soviet Russia. I think I talked about this with Rick. When I was living in Ekaterinburg in 94 and people were worried about me, I said, you shouldn't really be worried about me because I don't have anything. I don't own anything. I don't have a lot of money. There's no reason to bump me off. But if I owned a platinum mine, or if I owned a steel mill and somebody else wanted it, we could talk about buying and selling, or we could just fit the guy for a cement casket. So that's probably what this guy did, right? And so the Putin regime decided to arrest him, right? 4 or 5 months ago for these supposed acts that happened 25 years ago, and they put him in handcuffs, put him in an airplane, and flew him to Moscow and put him in prison. And the people in Khabarovsk were obviously upset and exercised, and so there have been demonstrations fairly constant in Khabarovsk, anti-Putin demonstrations. So there are pockets of resistance to Putin throughout the Russian Federation, and it's one of the reasons why Navalny was in Tomsk and Novosibirsk. Novosibirsk, where I actually was in September, one of the places I stopped with students on our 2019 Trans-Siberian. Novosibirsk is kind of the academic center of what was the Soviet Union and now is the Russian Federation. There's a huge, it's called an academic city, Akademgorodak, academic city, where there are all kinds of institutes for geology and physics, and actually the one Nobel Prize, the Soviet Nobel Prize winner, Mr. Kantorovich, who more or less invented linear programming, he was headquartered in Novosibirsk. So it's a center of academics, and as an academic, I can tell you, academics tend to be the most obnoxious and uncivilizable and recalcitrant individuals. They don't take orders easily, which is why they chose to be academics. And also, obviously, lots of intellectual workers, and so that's fertile ground for resistance and rebellion. Like in East Germany, in the German Democratic Republic, the first protests weren't in Berlin, they were in Dresden and Leipzig, kind of high-tech cities that were more or less academic and intellectual, and then eventually the protests got to Berlin, and when they got to Berlin, the game was up. The thing I worry about constantly is that there's no Gorbachev in Moscow. There's Putin, and Putin has obviously no scruples about killing people, and I'm not sure he might not have scruples about a Tiananmen Square action as well. The East German leadership of the SED, the East German Communist Party, sent congratulations to the Chinese Communist Party in May of '89 for their successful handling of the Tiananmen outbreak. And that's what they were prepared to do in Berlin and Dresden and Leipzig. But fortunately for the world, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev told the Soviet military, you stay in your barracks and you keep all of the East German troops, the Volksarmee, in their barracks as well. And so there was no bloodshed whatsoever.
Well, wasn't that also the time when the military, the Russian military, was flat broke? If I recall correctly, in East Berlin, the military had no money. They were going through trash cans looking for food. It was a sign that it was about to fall, and it was not good. I think that was around that time.
Well, wasn't that also during the time in 1999 with the fall of the ruble? That's when I was in St. Petersburg and also in Tashkent in Uzbekistan, and it was like people had their savings went to zero practically.
Yeah, in August of '98 is when the Yeltsin government nullified all public debt and canceled the 1993 rubles, and that to some extent was what gave Putin his initial acceptance. Is that, as I think I'm sure I told y'all, as we would say in Texas, my time in Ekaterinburg in 1994, I got to live through real inflation. Right, inflation was about 100% a month. Prices were doubling every month.
Yeah,
and Putin stopped that. And so, from 2000, when Putin took over, until 2004, 2005, Putin was probably the most popular government leader in the world, because he settled kind of the gross instability in the economy, especially with inflation and the monetary system, and he to some extent brought the power of the oligarchs under his control. Now, essentially, what he did is trade one set of oligarchs who weren't beholden to him for another set of oligarchs who were completely beholden to him, but for the Russian people. And also, up until 2008, the price of oil was going up, and therefore Putin had some funds to kind of subsidize the Russian economy. That's another thing that's going on right now that also has Putin between a rock and a hard place, is that oil prices are extremely low, and the Russian government is running a huge deficit. And the amazing thing, last week, there was an announcement by the budget minister in Russia that they were actually taking money away from the military to fund Social Security payments and government unemployment benefits. That the economic situation, the budget had gotten so bad that they have to cut military spending.
Well, sorry to jump in, but I was just thinking, so do you see a parallel between now and 1999? Because that's when the price of oil dropped. Remember, the ruble collapsed, and there was all kinds of problems. And I wonder if there's some kind of parallel, because the price of oil was low then too.
That's a good point. That's one of the things that is limiting the options that Putin has. And one of the ways in which he subsidized Mr. Lukashenko was that Russia would sell Belarus petroleum at below market prices, and Belarus would either sell it to Western Europe for market prices and make the difference, or they'd refine it and sell it as refined, and that was one of their chief income sources. To go back to Rick's really good point, that was one of the reasons why Gorbachev had to kind of say no more, because in the late 80s, I remember it was a bad time to be in Texas and Oklahoma because the oil price was really, really low. It's when I went home to Texas, you'd see guys by the side of the freeway selling their Rolexes and their Cadillacs because the oil price was down to like $10 a barrel, and Gorbachev realized he couldn't continue to subsidize all of the Eastern European communist parties because he couldn't even afford to subsidize the Soviet economy. So yeah, that's a good parallel, Susan, and something that Mr. Putin wishes would change. But
no, I thought Putin and the Saudis. No, I thought Putin and the Saudis did a gambit to make the U.S. go down, and they did. They hit us hard, but they both increased production, lowered prices, and then they didn't know how to get out of it.
Right. Yeah. I think the circular firing squad analogy is probably apt here. That and there is no honor among thieves.
No.
And so, yes, Mohammed bin Salman thought his friend Vladimir was going to cut production, and or keep production at the limits, and Vladimir thought his friend MBS was going to do the same thing, and they both cheated.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah, it was brilliant.
Yeah. So, and unfortunately for all of my friends in Oklahoma in the oil business, things are not going to be good for a long time, if ever. Right?
You think it's going to be prolonged?
Yeah, I don't think the price of oil is going to go above $40 a barrel for the next 10 years. If it may go down, right?
Wow. Okay, interesting.
My next car is either a Tesla or a Polestar, right?
Yeah. Oh, gosh.
Or it may be a Schwinn.
We should talk
right?
about energy security sometime, because you think about it, Russia is in good shape because they have salt and they have nickel and lithium and the things that are needed. We don't.
No,
but that's the same thing about World War II, that we're running out of rubber. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And we come up with synthetic, whatever. Right. So, yeah, Russia has those things, but they can't use them, right? If people don't, if there's not a strong demand, then nickel and palladium and all that stuff is worthless to them, because they don't have the manufacturing capability to use it, and there are other places as well. So.
Well, Ed, we're out of time. This is a great conversation. Got to have you back on. We got to do part 2 of this one, because I think we're, again, touching the surface of some pretty interesting stuff. And I still have a theory that the U.S. and Russia would probably do better joining up against the Chinese than not. And nobody talks about that much, but I think that's still an option out there. It may work.
Maybe. Although the Chinese have more things that we can use than the Russians. Yeah.
Well, no, but I'm thinking that it also might work against the EU, which is also not exactly on our side either. So it's kind of an interesting where things are going and where it might wind up. I don't know yet. It's interesting, and nobody's to be trusted.
Nobody knows yet, Rick. That's in some ways, I tell my students the most brilliant answer you can give to a lot of questions is I don't know.
I don't know.
I think I can say I don't know in at least 6 languages. Right? So,
yeah. Or you just do the old.
Yeah.
Anyway, hey Ed, it was a pleasure having you on again. We look forward to the next time, and we'll make sure it's not too far down the road. I think this is a really good conversation. Spark some interest in people, and a lot of people aren't talking about this. At least not much. There's too many other stupid things to talk about, but this is a good one, and it may affect us in a lot of ways. So we shall see. Ed, thanks again for coming on. Susan, as always, we'll see you the week after next, and Harold, thanks for joining in today, and at least in my case, teaching me about 2 countries I never heard of. It's amazing. Have a good one, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the show. Give us your feedback, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.